In the first season of this podcast, I made an episode called Love and Sex in Little Women, where I discussed about the way the Victorians began to connect sexual attraction to romantic love and marriage. Sexual attraction and romantic love, they have of course always been going hand in hand, but in the 19th century that is when people started to connect that to marriage. And when I made that episode, somebody left a comment saying, yes, there is love in Little Women, but sex? I don't think so. And I was like, give this episode a go and then come back and tell me if there was sex or not. The confusion is understandable because in the 19th century, people were not allowed to talk about sex. And when I speak about sex here, I don't only mean the thing itself, but any kind of physical interaction, such as kissing or making out or just holding hands. For the Victorians, it was not appropriate to show any kind of physical interaction or speak about anything of that sort. They had to use euphemisms when speaking about these things. In Little Woman, when there is the sex scene between Meg and John, it is written with euphemisms. Meg and John have a, quote, moment of bliss, and then Meg opens the door wearing John's shirt. Then there is the scene that I always read as an afterglow scene in Little Man, where the narrator says that Frederick and Jo found their, quote, truest rest and happiness from each other's company. I have read some really bad analysis on Jo's and Frederick's relationship. People saying that Jo must be an asexual or that Frederick must be an asexual, and these people base these assumptions to this idea that why would Jo say no to, quote, sexy and erotic Laurie and marry an asexual man? And Greta Gerwig said something similar to this. How could Jo say no to the handsome Laurie / Timothée Chalamet? And they explain it saying that Jo must be an asexual or gay, or Frederick not being an asexual person at all, just because Jo rejected Laurie, which doesn't make much sense. It is frustrating because you will get the feeling that these people haven't read the novel at all. This is a quote from Christina from Under the Umbrella blog. Gerwig tried to make something Little Woman isn't because she did not like Little Woman, and she might as well have made her own story rather than mangle an already beloved story and get people to believe misconceptions and myths that totally twist the public's idea of what the story is and its characters really are. End quote. A lot of the Jo and Frederick discourse seems to be based on that. I recently read an essay which handled Laurie's masculinity, and it once again had, quote, Jo married an older asexual man. Frederick is written to be 39 in the novel when Jo meets him in New York, and he's attracted to her and Jo is attracted to him, but because of the social restrictions of that time, they cannot directly express their interest, and if Beth would not have become ill, Jo would have stayed in New York a lot longer, because they don't argue in the book like they argue in the films. They are friends when they part in the novel, and they wonder if they are going to see again, and if that can lead to something bigger. A year later, when Beth has passed away and Frederick comes to court Jo, there is a moment after his first visit where he looks at Jo's picture and he kisses it, and he imagines Jo with her hair loose. In the 19th century, loose hair was a sign of open sexuality. I know I have some great asexual listeners who appreciate Jo and Frederick the way they are, but I think we can all agree that that is not an asexual behavior. Like, an asexual person would not think somebody in such ways. Earlier on that same day when Frederick comes to Jo, Jo is so happy to see him. She observes him when he's talking to Jo's father, and just like when they were in New York, Jo is checking him out. She pays attention to his big hands and his fine forehead and his eyes. And then she begins to think why he is there. And then she thinks that, oh, maybe he actually came to see me. And then she gets all flushed. Quote from Little Woman chapter Surprises. Dear old fellow, he couldn't have got himself up with more care if he had gone wooing, said Jo to herself, and then a sudden thought born of the words made her blush so dreadfully that she had to drop her ball and go down a drift to hide her face. This entire chapter is written this way. How either Jo is lusting over Frederick or he is thinking of her in more intimate ways. Once again, Jo doesn't sound like an asexual person or somebody who is not into men. And if you read Louisa May Alcott's journals from the time when she was in her early 20s, she has a diary marking where she describes a similar encounter. So either there was somebody who came to, quote, woo her, or it was somebody who came for a visit, her family, and then the author, in this case, fantasized that he came to woo her. You do find a great deal of fake news and false information from Little Woman studies, many of them inspired by films like the 2019 Little Woman, where everything that happens between Jo and Fredrik is ignored. Victorian society was very different, and when the part 2 came out, it received backlash because it handled Jo's sexual awakening, and that was not considered appropriate because you weren't allowed to speak those things aloud. In Little Woman there are lots of scenes of Jo and Fredrik kissing and making out, which we will discuss more in the course of this podcast. But even if you think about the moment in the Under the Umbrella chapter, Jo kisses Fredrik and the narrator says that she would have done it even if the birds on the fence had been people. And that was considered very scandalous in the 19th century because you were not supposed to show physical affection in public. I have read some speculations from Alcott biographies that actually Louisa herself was a very passionate person and perhaps a very sexual person as well, but the sexual encounters with men are censored in her journals by her, and you had to be very careful during those times because there wasn't any kind of birth control. That was also one of the reasons why romantic love and sex became more intertwined with marriage, whereas before marriages were made because of money and property. And in some countries, I know that sometimes women were not allowed to inherit their father, so the money would go to the nearest male relative, or they would only get a small percentage of their father's inheritance. That's why they were pressured to marry more wealthy men. I don't know how it was in America, but I know that was the case, at least in Victorian England. In the 19th century, readers imagined Jo to be pretty, and then they wanted her to end up with Laurie because he was more conventionally attractive. People in the 19th century were obsessed with this idea of Jo and Laurie being pretty and young and in love, and they didn't want to see them to grow. And there are lots of millions of Little Woman fans who still feel this way. Most of them are pretty young, but I have come across women who are way older than I am and still say that Jo should have ended up with Laurie because he was handsome and rich. In the novel, Jo is not written to be very attractive, and I found this quote from Louisa May Alcott herself, where she puzzles why readers ignore what she has written. Quote, "Why people will think Jo is small when she is described as tall? I don't see it. Why insist that she must be young when she is said to be 30 at the end of the book?" End quote. That was a quote between Louisa and the Lucan sisters, who were fans of hers. Here's a bit more about their correspondence. Quote, "Younger and more naive readers than the Lucan says, the oldest Lucan sister would have been closer to 20 at the time of this exchange with Alcott, sometimes completely failed to understand Jo as a fictional character. They address the author both as Jo and Miss Alcott. People insist on seeing themselves in Jo, and maybe it is because of the movies. We seem to go more further and further away from the novel. Things like Jo's sexual awakening and her love for Fredrik, and then the desire to have a brother in Laurie, so she can have some of that, quote, male freedom. Those things are literal disguises about the things that happened in Louisa May Alcott's life. But even more than that, Jo represents her values and morals and what she thought was important in life, and the transcendentalist views on personal growth, which is something that a lot of people don't like to pay attention. I'm actually quite fascinated by the transcendentalists. That's why I like to talk about them a lot. Louisa May Alcott was 33 when she wrote Little Woman. Why people don't want to see Jo growing up, I don't know. In the novel, it is really Laurie who is holding her back, and there is the contradiction. Louisa liked to hang out with the younger men, but being in a relationship with one when you don't romantically love them and you have this maternal nature, that's not so simple. Then there are these older men who she was into. I recently bought myself a new set of essays that handle Louisa's and Henry's relationship. I'll keep you updated if I find something new. And I read this quote from 1933 where it was said that, quote, Alcott did have multiple romantic affairs during her life, but they are not meant for prying eyes. When it comes to this podcast, that train went by a long time ago. I think we actually have quite a lot of information about Louisa May Alcott's love life and possible sexual encounters. I started my research studying the real-life Fredrik and the real-life Laurie, and that's where I found them. And I hope there is going to be more increasing interest towards that topic. Unfortunately, because when you get people like Greta Gerwig saying that all of these relationships in Little Women are nonsense, just because she didn't like the way Fredrik looked like, that creates lots of difficulties in the research because then people don't pay any attention to what happens in the novel. Jo most definitely found Fredrik very attractive. Like, read the chapter Surprises and chapter Friend, the chapter where Jo goes to New York for the first time. They are filled with this long description how Jo thinks Fredrik is hot. And they continue the sequels. In Little Man there's the afterglow scene, then there's the making out scene, then in Jo's post there are tons of making out scenes. When in doubt, go back to the novel.